Okay, pretend to look smart, fake it till you make it, and good. It's gonna make a great snap. Hi, welcome to Module 5, Lecture 13 for the course Introduction to International Relations. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about two very provocative articles from Chapter 5 of the Minkston-Snyder textbook, The Transformation of the Arab World and The Clash of Civilizations. So, to begin, we're going to talk a little bit about the reasons for this tremendous social phenomenon called the Arab Spring. And who better to tell the story about how ideology has changed and the position of people within the Muslim world galvanized support for these popular uprisings than someone who has studied this for quite some time and reports a lot of data about what was going on in the mindset of people in the Middle East. So for the next several minutes, we're going to watch a popular TED Talk, and then we'll return to talk about the transformation of the Arab world.
My talk today is about something maybe a couple of you have already heard about. It's called the Arab Spring. Anyone heard of it? Okay. So in 2011, power shifted from the few to the many, from Oval Offices to central squares, from carefully guarded airwaves to open source networks. But before Tahrir was a global symbol of liberation, there were representative surveys already giving people a voice in quieter but still powerful ways. I study Muslim societies around the world at Gallup. Since 2001, we've interviewed hundreds of thousands of people, young and old, men and women, educated and illiterate. My talk today draws on this research to reveal why Arabs rose up and what they want now. Now, this region's very diverse, and every country is unique, but those who revolted shared a common set of grievances and have similar demands today. I'm going to focus a lot of my talk on Egypt. It has nothing to do with the fact that I was born there, of course. But it's the largest Arab country, and it's also one with a great deal of influence. But I'm going to end by widening the lens to the entire region, to look at the mundane topics of Arab views of religion and politics, and how this impacts women, revealing some surprises along the way. So after analyzing mounds of data, what we discovered was this. Unemployment and poverty alone did not lead to the Arab revolts of 2011. If an act of desperation by Tunisian fruit vendors sparked these revolutions, it was the difference between what Arabs experienced and what they expected that provided the fuel. To tell you what I mean, consider this trend in Egypt. On paper, the country was doing great. In fact, it attracted accolades from multinational organizations because of its economic growth. But under the surface was a very different reality. In 2010, right before the revolution, even though GDP per capita had been growing at 5% for several years, Egyptians had never felt worse about their lives. Now, this is very unusual because globally we find that, not surprisingly, people feel better as their country gets richer. And that's because they have better job opportunities and their state offers better social services. But it was exactly the opposite in Egypt. As the country got more well-off, unemployment actually rose, and people's satisfaction with things like housing and education plummeted. But it wasn't just anger at economic injustice. It was also people's deep longing for freedom. Contrary to the clash of civilization theory, Arabs didn't despise Western liberty. They desired it. As early as 2001, we asked Arabs and Muslims in general around the world what they admired most about the West. Among the most frequent responses was liberty and justice. In their own words, to an open-ended question, we heard their political system is transparent and it's following democracy in its true sense. Another said it was liberty and freedom and being open-minded with each other. Majorities as high as 90% and greater in Egypt, Indonesia, and Iran told us in 2005 that if they were to write a new constitution for a theoretical new country, that they would guarantee freedom of speech as a fundamental right, especially in Egypt. 88% said moving toward greater democracy would help Muslims progress, the highest percentage of any country we survey. But pressed up against these democratic aspirations was a very different day-to-day experience, especially in Egypt. While aspiring to democracy the most, they were the least likely population in the world to say that they had actually voiced their opinion to a public official in the last month, at only 4%. So while economic development made a few people rich, it left many more worse off. As people felt less and less free, they also felt less and less provided for. So rather than viewing their former regimes as generous, if overprotective fathers, they viewed them as essentially prison wardens. So now that Egyptians have ended Mubarak's 30-year rule, they potentially could be an example for the region. If Egypt is to succeed at building a society based on the rule of law, it could be a model. If, however, the core issues that propelled the revolution aren't addressed, the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for Egypt, but for the entire region. The signs don't look good, some have said. Islamists, not the young liberals that sparked the revolution, won the majority in parliament. The military council has cracked down on civil society and protests, and the country's economy continues to suffer. Evaluating Egypt on this basis alone, however, ignores the real revolution. Because Egyptians are more optimistic than they have been in years, far less divided on religious secular lines than we would think, and poised for the demands of democracy. Whether they support Islamists or liberals, Egyptians' priorities for this government are identical, and they are jobs, stability, and education, not moral policing. But most of all, for the first time in decades, they expect to be active participants, not spectators, in the affairs of their country. I was meeting with a group of newly elected parliamentarians from Egypt and Tunisia a couple of weeks ago. What really struck me about them was that they weren't only optimistic, but they kind of struck me as nervous, for lack of a better word. One said to me, our people used to gather in cafes to watch football, or soccer, as we say in America. And now they gather to watch Parliament. They're really watching us, and we can't help but worry that we're not going to live up to their expectations. And what really struck me is that less than 24 months ago, it was the people that were nervous about being watched by their government. And the reason that they're expecting a lot is because they have a newfound hope for the future. So right before the revolution, we said that Egyptians had never felt worse about their lives, but not only that, they thought their future would be no better. What really changed after the ouster of Mubarak wasn't that life got easier, it actually got harder. But people's expectations for their future went up significantly, and this hope, this optimism endured a year of turbulent transition. One reason that there's this optimism is because, contrary to what many people have said, most Egyptians think things really have changed in many ways. So while Egyptians were known for their single-digit turnout in elections before the revolution, the last election had around 70% voter turnout, men and women. Where scarcely a quarter believed in the honesty of elections in 2010, I'm surprised it was a quarter, 90% thought that this last election was honest. Now, why this matters is because we discovered a link between people's faith in their democratic process and their faith that oppressed people can change their situation through peaceful means alone. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. The Egyptian people and many other Arabs who've revolted and are in transition have very high expectations of the government. They're just victims of a long-time autocracy, expecting a paternal state to solve all their problems. But this conclusion would ignore a tectonic shift taking place in Egypt far from the cameras in Tahrir Square. And that is, Egyptians' elevated expectations are placed first on themselves. In the country once known for its passive resignation, where as bad as things got, only 4% expressed their opinion to a public official, today, 90% tell us that if there's a problem in their community, it's up to them to fix it. And 3/4 believe they not only have the responsibility, but the power to make change. And this empowerment also applies to women, whose role in the revolts cannot be underestimated. They were doctors and dissidents, artists and organizers. A full third of those who braved tanks and tear gas to ask or to demand liberty and justice in Egypt were women. Now, people have raised some real concerns about what the rise of Islamist parties means for women. What we found about the role of religion and law and the role of religion in society is that there's no female consensus. We found that women in one country look more like the men in that country than their female counterparts across the border. Now, what this suggests is that how women view religion's role in society is shaped more by their own country's culture and context than one monolithic view that religion is simply bad for women. Where women agree, however, is on their own role, and that it must be central and active. And here is where we see the greatest gender difference within a country on the issue of women's rights. Now, how men feel about women's rights matters to the future of this region, because we discovered a link between men's support for women's employment and how many women are actually employed in professional fields in that country. So the question becomes, what drives men's support for women's rights? What about men's views of religion and law? Is a man's opinion of the role of religion in politics shape their view of women's rights? The answer is no. We found absolutely no correlation, no impact whatsoever between these two variables. What drives men's support for women's employment is men's employment. their level of education, as well as a high score on their country's UN Human Development Index. What this means is that human development, not secularization, is what's key to women's empowerment in the transforming Middle East. And the transformation continues. From Wall Street to Mohammed Mahmoud Street, it has never been more important to understand the aspirations of ordinary people. Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that TED Talk on the Arab Spring, and I think what it does a great job of doing is highlighting some of the actual data that speaks to the ideas, the aspirations of people in the Middle East, and what they were hoping to accomplish by agitating for change and trying to shift the paradigm in the region away from dictatorship and authoritarianism to one of greater democracy and freedom. And so we're going to now shift over to the article on the transformation of the Arab world and just highlight some of the main points that were described by the author. So initially, one thing we should pay attention to is the fact that the demonstrators in the Arab Spring countries, while they did not take power, they agitated for change. And so this is a long process. Transition doesn't occur overnight. And so in many of those countries, the transition is incomplete. But what they did was to get that discussion started by trying to, in some cases, overthrow regimes that had oppressed their people for decades. And so think about that in our context. Lots of people complain about issues that happen in the United States, but we have democratic channels for funneling our discontent and for registering our displeasure about how the government is being run. We can engage in elections, right? We can vote out people that we don't like. But in these places, there was a lot of discontent, and the only possible avenue for changing the way that society was run in many of these cases was to overthrow the government that was responsible for the situation at hand. Also, again, to speak to the fact that this is an incomplete process and certainly one that's going to take a long period of time, those who gained power as a result of these transitions were not necessarily democratic, and in certain occasions they actually promoted religion in government and society. So we saw in some cases the pendulum kind of swing away from maybe an autocratic regime to one that was more of a theocratic regime, or certainly one that was more religious than the previous regime. So that doesn't necessarily put the people in those countries in a better position to achieve the kinds of goals that and aspirations that they had. So again, there's this tension between what is possible, but one actual strength that you can identify from the transition that occurred during the Arab Spring was that at least the ball got rolling, even if the transitions are not yet complete by a long shot. And because democratization is a process, and I talked about this with respect to the United States, how in fact we tend to forget that the United States did not become a democracy overnight, and that there was a revolution involved. And so as the pendulum swung away from these autocratic regimes and toward these more Islamist or theocratic type regimes, what they have to recognize is that because the people's ideas about what they want have only solidified over time, as we saw from the TED Talk and the evidence that was presented, these parties, if they want to survive, they will have to adapt to the realities inherent in those countries. People are not going to say, well, we just didn't want that regime in place. We're now comfortable with a kind of different style regime that still oppresses people. That's not going to be good enough for people who are agitating for greater freedom in their own countries. So these parties need to recognize that, and if they want to survive this transformation, they're going to have to adapt and include some kinds of democratic principles and ways of governing that perhaps are not directly or inherently associated with rule by religious parties. And so, kind of echoing what was discussed in the TED Talk, in order to understand the gravity of this change in the Arab world, we have to set aside two main assumptions that we have probably often heard in the media or in popular discourse as being kind of totalizing assessments of the degree of democratization in the Arab world and the likelihood that these countries make the successful transition away from the oppressive regimes that were in power. And the first is that democracy requires a secular society. As we saw from toward the end of the TED Talk, it wasn't the case that women's employment was a function of men's religious views, but it had to do more with the development levels of those societies. So it suggests that you don't need a society necessarily to become completely secular and to throw out religion altogether, but that religion can coincide or coexist alongside democratization. The second assumption that we have to set aside is that democracies must be, by their very nature, liberal, or in this case, what that means is open to alternative views and reform. Indeed, in the example of Tunisia, the secularists have expressed a desire to be as oppressive to those who are religious as we might think of those who are religious wish to oppress those who are more secular. So these types of complex notions about the Arab world must be kind of set aside if we are to accept the realities on the ground. And one of the main points of this article is that although Islam remains front and center in the Arab world, to be sure, religiosity, which refers to how religion is actually practiced, has changed, and political secularism is emerging. So what this suggests is that there may be two different spheres, or maybe these spheres are becoming disentangled between the religious sphere in the Arab world and the political sphere, and it is increasingly the case that religion is being viewed as less appropriate for the political sphere than in the past. On to Samuel Huntington's famous article, Clash of Civilizations. So what we're going to do is talk about some of the main ideas about this article, and then examine some evidence which sheds light on whether these arguments are still valid. So the hypothesis that Huntington presents in his article is that a major source of conflict in the modern world will be based on civilizations, not politics or economics. And to work with the definition here to get us all on the same page, a civilization, according to Huntington, is the highest cultural grouping of people and the broadest level of cultural identity that people have. And he identifies 8 major civilizations: Western, Confucian, Japanese, Islamic, Hindu, Slavic Orthodox, Latin American, and possibly African. So, why might this be happening? Why would we see the emergence of conflict across civilizational lines? He says that civilizations are very different from one another. The world is becoming a smaller place due to the changes in telecommunications and travel. Economic modernization is eroding local identities as culture from parts of the Western world, for example, begins to infiltrate into places in the world that had previously been more isolated from cultural intrusion. The West has kind of dominated this discussion, and non-Western states are retreating and going back to their roots because they view the imposition of the West as a negative development caused by globalization, and that cultural differences are more permanent than political or economic ones, right? You can change your political identification, you may improve your economic status, but your cultural identification is something that's far more immutable. And finally, economic regionalism is increasing. So the civilization argument here is that you are seeing the world being carved out across different civilizational lines, and that is something we may observe in the economic domain where, like, for example, we have the North American Free Trade Agreement, and that is the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And then you're going to see other civilizations, right? We have the European Union, we have Mercosur in Latin America. set up their own kind of trade blocks based on common civilizations. So now let's look at some evidence that may shed some light on the veracity of this clash of civilizations thesis. So if we revisit one of the charts that we looked at, this has been updated. So this is from the end of World War II to 2014, and it looks at total warfare and then warfare within countries compared to the amount of warfare across countries. What you can see is that since the end of basically the Cold War, we've seen a marked decrease in interstate war over time. And even more pronouncedly, we've seen a decrease in societal warfare. So if the argument is that we are seeing increases in conflict between civilizations, the evidence so far from looking at conflict doesn't really bear that out in reality. What we see instead are decreases, globally speaking, in both intrastate and interstate conflict. What about our views on people from other countries, right? And so this has been a big debate and has been for a long time in the United States. What is the appropriate role of the federal government in curtailing immigration? On the other hand, this country is one of immigrants from all over the world. So what is it that people view about immigration? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And if you buy the clash of civilizations thesis, you should envision that people would be, especially in places like the United States, which is a melting pot, so to speak, you might see an increase in the percentage of people who think that immigration is bad and that we should stop the flow of immigrants to this country because it's having some kind of negative impact. But what you can see from the data from Gallup over the past, in this case, 13 years, is that actually there's been a relative stability in the percentage of people who think that immigration is good or bad, and that if anything, it has kind of gone up a little bit over time. It's decreased a little bit if you look at 2014 here, but the difference between those who think it's good and those who think it's bad is tremendous, right? We're talking, if you look at the 2014 numbers, that's 30 percentage points difference between those who think that immigration is good or bad. So if the clash of civilizations thesis really had a lot of water in this argument, you would likely see a decrease in the percentage of people who think that immigration is a good thing and a strong uptick in those who think it's bad. But what we see is it's pretty consistent over the past, over a decade, that a majority of people in the United States tend to think that immigration is actually a good thing. Now on to the last question about, are we seeing increasing economic regionalism? Well, a recent trend in the international system has been the increase in free trade agreements, and one of the more recent developments along that line has been the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And as you can see, if the world is being separated across civilizational lines, then that doesn't really explain why we see the emergence of trans-civilizational, trans-Pacific trade agreements that help to reduce trade barriers between countries in places like North America, South America, Australia, Southeast Asia. So the emergence of a Trans-Pacific Partnership does not support the thesis that there is a clash of civilizations, because we have several different civilizations that are represented in this one trade agreement.